you describe yourself as a person of color, a Scot of color, actually, to be quite specific. And I'm really interested in unpicking what the norms are around whiteness in Scottish education and also in Scottish cultural production. So I suppose I would ask that question in quite an open way and say, do you think whiteness is embedded as a norm in these areas?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it absolutely is. And if anything which is expressing itself in a way that's non-white, which I struggle with that
Mhm,
phrase in itself,
mhm,
is other. So your history, your perspective, your writing is othered.
yeah,
So even if you are Scottish and this is your country and this is your society, your experience and your perspective, the history that you bring or that you represent is is not only not the norm, it's not accepted as being part of this story of this nation. And I think what's really painful around that as you
mm,
grow up within that system is the realization when it comes, if it does come, that actually your family history, your voice, your experiences um, are very much part of this story of
mm,
Scotland. That the idea that we are here because you were there, but also that you are where you are
mhm,
because people of color built this nation. That
yeah,
we're integral to this country. That
mhm,
we came here. Many of us came here as citizens, as full citizens. We
mm,
weren't. We came here because this was our country. This is the wealth that we built, and this was where we belonged.
mhm,
And so uh, when that comes, when that realization comes, if it hasn't already, you've known that through your own family, but when you actually learn about that, and often for many people of color, you learn about that as an adult, and you realize that if you'd had that knowledge as a child,
mhm,
how powerful that would have been for your sense of belonging and for your sense of, um, and what that your sense of Scottishness.
yeah,
Um, So yeah, I think that whiteness or the absence of people of color within our stories, our
mhm,
nation's story, and is very is very strong, is very accepted, and the idea that people of color are visitors rather than actually integral to who we are and what we are and where we are.
Thanks for that answer. I was thinking about that and I wondered, you see, if at school you experience, for instance, in the teaching of history, perhaps you've mentioned history, or also of science. We often learn about that through the stories of famous inventors, people who have done important things in science. Now, how was that for you moving through school? Were you aware of the presence of people of color in those fields, science, in being famous, really, having created something important?
No, absolutely not. I think the only time I was ever aware of anyone of color was when it came to, maybe sports. In fact, I think I've got a poem where I talk about confusing my father was quite absent through my childhood, and I remember confusing him with Daley Thompson and Lenny Henry, and so or the people that ran the local shops, like the kind of the so it was those are the where you saw people of color. You didn't think that they existed in these in for example science or maths, or that we didn't think of them as didn't think of people of color as great thinkers. It was very um menial, or maybe very maybe kind of in medicine
Mhm.
perhaps, but the idea that we produced anything, that we contributed
Yeah.
to kind of world history as intellectuals or as great thinkers, or um, as people who changed things or had any sort of agency
Mhm.
was absent,
Mhm.
completely absent in terms of even if we ever even touched on things around, for example, kind of abolition or abolition movement and slavery. That was very much the sort of white savior
Yeah.
narrative. So um, yeah, and I think it was kind of lost the kind of thread of your question, but yeah, it was very much. I mean, that wasn't part of what I learned I mean, I was lucky enough to have, you know, a great mother who kind of tried to bring in these stories to me. And I remember being, we looked a lot. My mother was quite, we went on marches for anti-apartheid, and so I kind of had an idea that there was, there were strong, intelligent voices and people who were really making the world better and changing, and that there were that it wasn't, but that wasn't something I got from school or
Okay.
from the stories that were around me.
Yeah. So that really came from the home. And I was struck actually when you said that, because, of course, growing up in West Africa myself, in a former British colony, what happened is we had the same curriculum probably as you had in Scotland. And that was the norm for me as well. We didn't do um, figures from history, scientists, inventors. And so that becomes an invisible truth somehow. It just became the norm that the people who were prominent and who had agency were all white.
Mm.
Yeah. And that was a norm for me growing up as a Black person. Um, and I guess it would be the same norm for everybody who went through that educational system. So that's just part of the system.
And I
Yeah.
think it's that and that there's that real, and it's still there, but it's that real thing that there was a lot. I mean, I don't think we've really acknowledged that our educational system, that part of its role was to support colonialism.
Yeah.
And so actually that is why it's not an accident. It's not because people, it just wasn't, it's not what we did or what, but it was like it was a mission,
Mhm.
because that a mission and because of that story aided and supported the colonial adventure.
And created these permanent outsiders.
It's not an accident. And um I think that's really important to acknowledge. It wasn't just because we hadn't discovered or
Mhm.
we didn't know, or like, I mean, maybe as individuals, but this was known. So it was a mission for a reason. uh,
Yes.
and I think that's really important to acknowledge.
Yeah.
um,
And so what we're doing here actually, which I'm really excited about, is making visible a system that underpins racism, which is has always been there all along. But now we're actually sort of taking the curtains away and saying, let's all look at this together and let's see how we can make things better.
mm,
And so what I would try to do at this point is to move to your own cultural production. We've talked about Scottish education and your experience within Scottish education. And now, of course, there is this amazing play that you've written and directed, Lament for Sheku Bayoh. What moved you to write and direct this play?
um I mean, I was in a one I mean, it came from because I was asked to explore this. I was asked if I wanted to write about Sheku Bayo, and if I wanted to write a lament for Sheku Bayo. So there was I suppose there was that,
Mhm.
actually. But the reason why I wanted to do it and moved me to do it
Yeah.
was, first of all, is I didn't know enough. I mean, I knew it on the edges of my knowing, but I didn't know the story and I hadn't engaged with it. And I was that was really curious to me. It's like, why did I not turn towards this? What frightened me about this story, or what did I feel anxious about that I didn't follow it?
Mhm.
And why wasn't it better known? Why weren't we all talking about it? And so that was my starting point. And as I discovered more about Sheku Bayo and what happened to Sheku Bayo, it revealed for me about what it said to us, about what it said about all of us, and it said what it said about Scotland. And
Mhm.
I didn't I was writing a lament in that traditional sense, that I was one removed. I was the sort of, I wanted to write a play where it what we were keening and we were mourning, and it was an honouring, but it was also coming, I suppose it was coming from a place where I was sort of posing the question, or I was asking the audience to come and to discover their own truth around this, and to kind of, because all I had the whole play is made up of stuff that I found
Mhm.
on my own.
Yeah.
I didn't have any special access apart from one meeting um, with a memoir, which was really about just asking permission if it was okay for me to write this. Would the family be okay? So I didn't have any more access than anyone else did, and that felt really important to me
Mhm.
because it was a sort of public lamenting rather than a kind of investigation. I mean, this is not the story of Sheku Bayoh. This is the story of how his death affected us and what it says about to us as a nation, I think. Um, and I was moved to write it because it was I didn't know because I wanted to know, I think, initially, and then I was moved to write it because what I discovered in that in my looking for what happened to him was that he wasn't there. Like it was a so much of the way he was spoken about was stereotypes, was racial tropes, and to um, I wanted a space for mourning, to
Yeah.
really grieve the fact that this man was so well loved as a
Mhm.
brother and a son and as a father and as a partner and as a friend, and that felt important to give that space because it didn't seem that anyone had given that space really. And you know,
Yeah, that occurred to me when I watched it actually, because I became aware that I was dealing with a person at
mm,
that point. And I'm interested in how you introduced your interaction with Sheku Bayo because you mentioned you went to the family. And so you talked to one person, you mentioned a name.
I
What
didn't
did
go to
you
the family.
catch?
I went to the lawyer.
Okay, it
Yeah,
was the lawyer that you went to.
I went to the lawyer, and he was the family lawyer, so
Yeah.
he presented the family. So I didn't want to go. I didn't actually meet Caddy until after the play had been performed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be writing something that um, would be further pain, like would kind of add or be unwelcome on one level.
I think that for me it would be quite important to know how you were thinking about it when you went about doing your own sort of investigation of what was out there in public about this man.
Yeah, I mean that was where I came from. I came from doing the research and going, where is he? Where when did we stop talking about this person as um as a human being, as a complicated human being?
Mhm.
And we taught, and what I did find in the press was lots of talk about, or at least from the people, from certain individuals involved in the case, a lot talking about the humanity and the struggles that the police were suffering,
Mhm.
but nothing about who this person was, and a huge, just real lies, about who he was.
Mhm.
And I found glimpses of him in what the family said,
Mhm.
and what the family have done through this time. If they have been talking about Sheku Bayo and trying to change the narrative or offer the narrative of who this person was.
Mhm.
And that was kind of what I was trying to do when I was doing the research for the play, was looking for him.
Mhm.
And realizing that, if I was going to create a lament, if I was going to do a, because the idea of keening is it's they keeners take the load of the grief. That's what they do. They bear the grief for the
Mhm.
family.
Mhm.
And so I thought, if we were going to bear that grief, and for me it was the grief of the nation that we've lost this man.
Yeah.
Not It wasn't about the family. It was we've all lost him. We've
Mhm.
lost this man from
Mhm.
our community. And I thought, if we're going to bear that grief, then we're going to have to. Obviously there's an active imagination of like who was this man, and that is a sort of imagination. But it was based on what I read about what the family, especially statements that Caddy had made about him, and it was looking at that and looking at what um, so that was the way out. And there was a great documentary that was made, they had interviews with the friends, and so I was getting a glimpse of him. And then there were the photographs. There were these wonderful photographs that were released of him,
Mhm.
that really showed this beautiful smile, this happy. You just looked at him, thought, you could imagine being his friends, you could
Mhm.
imagine having him in your life.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
actually, how great, how amazing that would be to have this man in your life that you could see that he would be the person in the room that would, you could see his charisma.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that felt really important to me, to kind of to invite not only those little glimpses, but to invite the audience to imagine him too, to offer moments within the play for a kind of collective imagining of Sheku, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and that I think that was that was because what this play is a lament, and it's really important to remember that it's a mourning, it's a grieving,
Mm-hmm.
um, and an honouring.
That's really powerful, actually, because um, then it simply belongs there in the national narrative, you see, because what you said is that the picture that you found, especially through the press, um, was full of stereotypes. And if these are stereotypes that we're all used to hearing, and if we come to this person through the stereotypes, it gives you a completely different picture. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're very, and I think what you find when you read those, and what I wanted to sort of show in the play was that these are so familiar, that these aren't, because I think if you are unaware, and as we talked earlier, if we live in a culture where um white is default human.
Mm-hmm.
So these stereotypes offered the kind of the monstrous, the um the kind of superhuman strength, all of those things
Yeah.
can be read just as that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a person of color, or you know our colonial history, or you know the way in which racism has worked,
Yeah.
and the way in which dehumanization has worked, to support the kind of white supremacy, if you know those things,
Mm-hmm.
then you read that and they're all dog whistles. They're all like, as soon as you start reading that, you're like, oh, this is familiar. This
Yeah.
is stuff that's always used,
Mm-hmm.
always said.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to give that almost, to put that into the play, to say this is an old story. These are old tricks. These are familiar statements about a black man, and it's what is used to dehumanize and to yeah, to strip away the humanity of
Mm-hmm.
a person. And all of this has a long history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
None of this is actually about Sheku Bayoh.
Mm-hmm.
This is, all of these statements are actually about us.
Mm. So you're actually inviting us to take a look at ourselves as a society. That's a powerful thing to do.
To take responsibility for those statements,
Mm.
for not actually seeing them for what they are, I think, or at least not questioning them,
Mm-hmm.
not challenging them.
And if they had been challenged, if Shekubayo had just been seen as just another human being, then who knows?
Well, then I think he would have been treated. I mean, we live in a country that has got a huge problem with drugs, um, and the police are experienced in dealing with people having um, bad experiences on drugs and having mental health crisis. These are not things that we don't know. And I think if they had seen him the way they might have seen uh, exactly the same situation with someone who was white, I feel pretty strongly that they would not have approached that with the violence, and they wouldn't have escalated that the way they did.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
there is a point in the play where I'm explicit about that. Um, and yeah, and I think um, in my opinion and others, that feels pretty kind of obvious in a way. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that many people know how, um, or know within their own kind of circles of how young white men have 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 had those sort of experiences, and they haven't ended up dead.